Chapter 17, Act 17, Edward's Tale. Act 17, Edward's Tale, The Moonlit Rhapsody. Capo, 17 years prior.
Poor thing. To be orphaned at this age, it's almost crueler, isn't it? At least as a child, sometimes you are able to forget.
The young woman closed her eyes tighter, as if that act alone would block out the sound of her fellow mourners. But still, their whispers drifted around her hauntingly, clinging to the fibers of her black cotton shift like an unpleasant odor. Transferring her weight from one knee to the other, she took a deep breath, inhaling the spicy, woodsy incense that hung in the air above. Her hands were sheathed in black lace gloves that itched, and her rich navy blue hair, which normally garnered compliments and requests to stroke it from whoever laid eyes upon it, was hanging down her back in oily, rain-drowned tangles. A small black veil had been hastily clipped in her hair, obscuring what little she had left of her vision without the assistance of her glasses, which were folded and tucked away in her pocket. But the truth was, she didn't really want to be able to see any of what was before her clearly, not the two portraits that had been hurriedly selected from her parents' walls, both several years old as they had not sat down for one as a family since she had left for university, and certainly not the piles of tropical blooms that had been gathered from the desert that looked alien against the grey, rainy backdrop of the sky, and the two mithril urns that she knew contained nothing with an end. Merely stood for ceremony.
There was simply nothing left to recover. We did our best, but the fire from the bombing took everything. I'm so sorry, Harley.
And if she went another day in her life without hearing the words "I'm sorry," that would be okay too. She felt the bench she was kneeling on sink with a groan, and when she opened her eyes, she saw her neighbor, or at least the person that used to be her neighbor, when she had lived in Capo, watching her. His ruddy face was set in a kind, pathetic smile, but most importantly, his eyes had dared to meet hers. Everyone else had looked away as they gave their condolences, and it was obvious to anyone that the mourners wished they could be anywhere else in the world other than their rain-drowned little oasis, hosting yet another funeral for their fallen countrymen. It had been only 2 weeks since Castle Damcyan had been suddenly and brutally blown to bits by the Red Wings in an unprovoked aerial assault to steal the fire crystal. It was days into the aftermath that the castle's few survivors had been able to make their way to Capo to find help. Some remains found in the castle had been identifiable, one of note Miss Anna, a fellow resident of Capo who had been Prince Edward's bride-to-be and was the daughter of the great sage Tella. The lucky villagers were able to have confirmed for them by the castle survivors that their loved ones had been there when the bombing took place, gifting them at least a semblance of closure since they had no bodies to recover. Those who were not so lucky could only assume the worst, and prepared funeral arrangements as well.
How are you doing, Harley?
He asked softly.
You've been kneeling there for near 30 minutes now. A stretch might do you good.
She nodded, her dark blue eyes flicking back to people who were quietly murmuring around her. If she did leave, they wouldn't notice, all of these funerals were probably starting to blur together by now. Besides, she had run out of prayers 25 minutes ago. What else could one possibly say to their dead parents other than, "I'm sorry it wasn't me"? The man stood up, offering out his hand. Harley took it, and when she had pulled herself up to her full height, she towered several inches above him.
I think I'll take a walk around the village,
Harley said quietly. She made her exit from underneath the shelter that had been erected and stepped back into the warm rain, retrieving her glasses from her pocket and sliding them back on underneath her veil. Although her parents had been among the first to have been identified as victims in the bombing, word had not reached Harley until only a few days ago. She had been practicing an oral dissertation in a mirror that was her final requirement for graduation when the knock had come on her little dorm door, swiftly yet laden with hesitation. When she had opened it, she was greeted only by a small boy whom she had seen delivering various messages before throughout Troya, although none of them had ever been for her until now. He silently handed her the note, of which she saw the wax seal had already been broken, and fled. It was not unusual for messages to come pre-read nowadays, it was an unfortunate side effect of no longer being in peacetime, and the rampant paranoia of war had already reached Troya's shores, sparked by the theft of the Earth Crystal by the troublesome Dark Elf. The first line in the letter had been simple and to the point, without any flowery language, which Harley appreciated far more than she thought she would have at the time. Harley, there was an accident at Damcyan Castle, and I'm sorry to have to tell you that your parents are dead. After the funeral, she spent a few more days in Capo, closing up her parents' house and donating whatever was salvageable to the survivors, including anything she had left behind when she had originally departed for school. When she was able to hitch a ride back to Troya, she wrote letters via pigeon carrier to the only 2 people there who would have made note of her absence, and hoped that at least one of them would be waiting for her at the docks. When she finally arrived home, she was greeted by both her mentoring professor at school and her boyfriend, and wordlessly fell into their arms. I can never return to Damsion, she thought to herself. There's nothing left for me there, but maybe not anywhere else, either. What do you do when living one day at a time is suddenly too much?
So, do you feel ready for your dissertation tomorrow?
Her boyfriend, Garrett, was fumbling with his coat as he was preparing to walk her back to the dorm for the night. She had run through the entire presentation with him for what would be the final time, with all of the last-minute tweaks she had dreamt up on the way over.
I'm adequately prepared, I should think.
Harley buttoned her black dress coat, grunting with frustration as she pulled her long hair out of the collar where it had gotten caught. I've got to start wearing my hair up. I don't care if it's not the style for a young lady, it's terribly annoying.
You're not nervous at all. That would imply I am not ready, would it not? Well, you can still be nervous, even when you're happy. How so?
He turned to her, and for the first time, she noticed his cheeks were flushed, a shock of black hair falling over his eyes that he would have normally swept away by now. His hands, both stuffed into his pockets, were shaking. Harley arched one slender brow. Surely just discussing this was not bringing back memories of his own dissertation from a year ago? It wasn't that bad, was it? She didn't feel anxious about it at all. Did that mean there was something wrong with her?
Oh, hell, I wanted to wait until after, but I've been carrying this thing around for weeks.
He pulled out his hand, uncurling his fingers to reveal a delicate silver band with a sapphire nestled within. Harley blinked, and felt her glasses starting to slip down her nose from a sudden outbreak of sweat, but didn't make a motion to adjust them. She was frozen in place, and her heart had taken residence in her throat. Garrett swiftly took Harley's left hand in his own, sliding the band over her finger and gazing down at her. It was a little big, sliding down to her knuckle as her fingers bent forward.
I wanted to do this before. Well, before everything happened with your parents. But now that you know you want to stay in Troya after you graduate, I took it as a sign. I want you to marry me, Harley. I'll make you happy, you don't have to be alone anymore. That's what you want, right?
Harley stared down at the ring, but couldn't bring herself to say anything, even though her mind was racing with hundreds of thoughts. It's true. I don't want to be alone. I never want to be alone again. But does that equate to true happiness? He laughed apprehensively, gently letting go of her hand.
You don't have to answer now. I can see the wheels turning up there. Let's talk after you knock that dissertation out of the park, okay?
She kept staring at him, and he scratched his head.
Or, any time after. Just take your time.
The air filled Harley's lungs again, and a small smile broke across her face.
Thank you. I mean, well,
She held up her hand, the sapphire winking in the dying sunlight pouring through his bedroom window.
It's really beautiful.
He laughed, shaking his head. With Harley, that had gone as well as could have been expected. He would have fallen over in a dead faint if she had reacted even remotely like a normal girl. He escorted her to their usual halfway point, the Troyan castle, which was beginning to light up for the night. Harley lifted her hand to wave goodbye, and suddenly felt awkward when she saw the jewelry now adorning her finger, like it was a neon sign flashing something vulgar above her head. Blushing deeply, she quickly pivoted on her heel and sped past the guards, who were changing for the evening post. As her boots crunched on the gravel of the walkway, she thought she heard an enchanting chime ring through the air. At first, she thought it was the castle bells, but the hour was yet too early. Pausing, she tucked her hair behind her ears, and found her eyes searching at the very tops of the western castle towers, where a single window was illuminated with yellow light. Sure enough, the chime rang again, and after some hesitation, was followed by a serendipitous cascade of one silky note after another. Harley drew in a sharp breath, her heart bouncing along to the hurried, but melancholic rhythm. The new guard stepping outside caught Harley staring, and smiled.
That's Prince Edward playing his harp. He gets a little stronger each day. I've never heard his song so clearly until tonight.
Harley blinked.
Prince Edward? Of Damsion?
The guard nodded.
Yes, didn't you hear? He washed up here and was found by a passerby. The Epops took him in to nurse him back to health. He's not seeing visitors though, he's in really bad shape.
Of course, Harley nodded. She and the guard stood in silence until the notes drifted away a few moments later, and the light went out in the window of the tower. As she turned to make her way back to her dorm, she felt the tiniest hint of a flutter in her chest. That song. It was so serene, yet steeped in despair, like he captured all of the nightmares within my heart and turned them into something tortuously resplendent. He too understands what it means to mourn not only the dead, but to mourn the fact that you were the one who survived without understanding why. What were we left behind to accomplish? That's what his song was asking. I'm sure of it. Two months later, another insistent knock came at Harley's door. When she opened it, she once again found the small boy who had been the unknowing harbinger of the news that destroyed her world. This time, the letter he handed her was sealed, peace was upon them once more, the war coming to a swift and sudden end when a group of 5 heroes had gone to the moon to destroy the threat that had been pulling humanity's strings like a puppet master. But unlike before, when the seal had just been a broken wax smudge hurriedly applied by her neighbor, this one had the crest of Damcyan Castle embossed within. Harley felt her heart pound as she closed the door with her hip, her finger already sliding through the seal to pry it open. Having successfully defended her dissertation,
How Mana Manifests in Non-Magic Users Using the Human Bond as a Catalyst,
Harley graduated and found herself wondering she could possibly do next to keep herself and her depression from wandering down a dark path. Prince Edward was finally well enough to leave Troya, but word had quickly reached their shores that he was overwhelmed in managing the rebuild of Damcyan and was looking for an assistant to help him through it. Remembering the music she had heard on that strangely lonely night and how it had resonated in the depths of her heart, Harley wrote a passionate plea for the job and posted it before she could change her mind. She couldn't even remember what she had said, she had been in such a fervor, and she had forgotten about her vow to never return to Damcyan again. Since she had expected nothing to come from it, she supposed it didn't really matter. But much to her surprise, she had actually gotten a reply requesting her appearance for a trial request. The job would only last for a day or two while Edward was out of town at the future King Cecil of Baron's coronation, but Harley found herself stirred by the opportunity to get a change of scenery, even if it did mean returning to a place that no longer contained any of the people or things she had once loved. Strangely relieved that she did not have to explain anything to her fiancé, who was out of town on an expedition to study black chocobos up north, Harley made her way to Damcyan, completed the task, and had returned to Troya without anyone knowing, having heard nothing else until now. Pushing her glasses up her nose, Harley's eyes began to scan the letter. Dear Harley, it would be my sincere privilege to ask if you would consider undergoing training to become a secretary that would serve the whole of Damcyan. You being here for just a short time greatly impacted our project for the positive, and I would be anxious to see what you could do for our future with a full dedication of resources under your express control. I hope you will take this request under serious advisement. I know a bright, idealistic woman like yourself has many opportunities fighting for her attention, and I will be disappointed if I should lose out. However, I know that no matter what path you may choose to take, the world will be better for it. As such, I will close this request by humbly asking if you would consider returning home. All the best. Edward Chris von Muir. Harley bit her lip, reading the letter thrice over before folding it and sliding it onto her desk. She had never told Prince Edward, either in her initial letter to him or her in-person visit, that she had used to live in Capo. She had spoken of losing her parents in the war, seeking purpose, her dream of finding that minute ray of hope that was in the bottom of Pandora's box, but she had never been specific about her particular circumstances. Did he attempt to learn more about me after I departed? She wondered, her brow furrowed. Or was he able to somehow sense that he and I shared the same terrible fate? Is that why his music drew me to him in the first place? Is fate a type of bond between humans, too, I wonder? She picked up the letter once more, memorizing the textured grain of the paper as she trailed her fingertips over it, and noting the rush of her pulse when they brushed the Damcyan seal. Edward has a vision, hope for a future that isn't blighted by war, where one can go home again and begin anew. Is that what I want to believe too? I feel like it's been so long since I've felt the warmth of hope. Lifting her left hand, she eyed the silver band wrapped around her finger, a promise that she would never have to be alone again, a promise that someone would love her until the end of time, the gods willing, the same kind of promise Anna and Edward had made. Garrett's eyes lit up when he saw Harley sitting upon the small hill by the swimming pond in town. Normally it was covered in sunbathing beauties who were anxious to give their worship to the sun, but at night it stood mostly deserted, especially since the summer had not yet reached the glorious zenith where the sun shone long into the evening hours. Harley, pale and ethereal and always cold, was wrapped in her favorite black coat, her hair swept into a bun that was sculpted with the precision of a surgeon's hands. Wrapped in the iridescent light of the stars, she was the human version of the moon goddess, Selene.
It's been a while,
he smiled, starting to sit down. But instead, Harley stood up, her lips pressed in a small smile in return. He faltered a bit, catching himself before plopping down in the grass.
I've accepted a position in Damcyan as secretary in training to the future king,
Harley said, her voice lifting near the end of her confession. Garrett paused.
Don't you have to be in Damcyan to do a job like that? Yes.
He frowned.
But I thought you said you didn't want to ever go back? Too many bad memories.
Harley looked down at her feet.
I thought that too, yes. But perhaps I was not being rational at the time, with everything that had happened. This is just something that feels right. Something my heart tells me I have to do.
She looked up at him.
Which I understand is not me being rational now, either. It's just hard to explain, I suppose. I'd say.
He trailed off, shaking his head.
So? You just want us to pack up and go, just like that? I just got my job at the university I'd had my eye on for so long. Would there really be anything like that for me in a place like Damcyan? It's a hub for trade, right? Is there really a place for someone as educated as the two of us to thrive? There was a reason you left all those years ago, right?
Harley closed her eyes and took a slow breath, mentally counting to 5. She anticipated that pushback, of course. She had practically scripted their entire conversation on the way to the hill, and most of it was unfurling exactly as she had expected. That was how well she knew Garrett. Taking his hand into hers, she willed herself to look into his eyes, even though she was screaming on the inside.
You belong here, living your dream. I could never take that away from you, and I would never ask you to give it up for me. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I did. You would grow to resent me for being so selfish. I don't think I understand what my dream is, quite yet, but I think I've found the place where it can come into bloom once I do.
He looked away, clenching his jaw. She could see the beginnings of tears gather in the corners of his eyes, they shone like diamond dust in the light of the full moon. His voice shook as the poisonous words spewed out.
What are you saying? That you want to go to Damcyan, alone?
She could only bring herself to nod. She knew she was being a coward, but she didn't think her heart could take much more. She was watching a man break before her very eyes. Prying open his fingers, she deposited the silver ring, and was simultaneously relieved and ashamed by the lightness in her chest as soon as it had left her grasp.
I'm sorry.
Damcyan, the night before the moon's return.
I have urgent business to discuss with the king. Is His Highness present?
The guard narrowed his eyes, crossing his arms over his chest.
If you would lower your voice, sir. The king is currently occupied with matters of utmost importance.
The man who had addressed the guard threw his hands into the air. He was wearing green robes and his cheeks had gradually gone from shades of red to the rich purple of a plum. You could practically see his blood pressure jumping off the charts and making a run for it across the Damcyan desert.
There is no time for that. There are serious financial matters that must be addressed at once.
The guard sighed. How many times had he needed to have this same exact conversation every week as of late? He didn't get paid enough to deal with this passive-aggressive game between nobles.
We were ordered not to let anyone through, sir. If you would kindly return at a later time. It's very late tonight anyway. Can it really not wait until the morning?
The man reached into his robes, smacking a pile of papers against his hand.
This is an insult. I have come to conduct official business. What seems to be the matter?
A woman entered the antechamber, her navy hair wrapped into a bun that was tucked under the black velvet academic cap she had pinned to her hair. A purple thigh-length tunic peeked out of her form-fitting black dress coat, with matching black leggings underneath that were ideal for both her modesty and for climbing up tall ladders in the library. Black, rectangular glasses sat above her pert nose, and gold orb earrings dangled from her lobes that matched the clasps on her coat, which wrapped loosely around her narrow chest and abdomen.
"Ah! Harley!"
the man exclaimed, grasping her hands excitedly.
"Could you help me talk some sense into these people?"
Harley blinked. What exactly had she walked into here? She had just been making her rounds before heading to bed for the night.
"What is the problem, Chancellor?"
The Chancellor dumped his papers into her hands, and she nearly fell forward from the weight.
"Our ledgers have yet again fallen into the red this month. Damcyan is facing a severe financial crisis."
Harley licked the tip of her finger as she flipped through some of the pages, quickly scanning through the most pertinent data. Well, he's certainly not lying. But it's not that bad. Edward must have been evading him for quite a while if he's getting this worked up. She put the papers back in order, and gave her best professional smile, not too eager, but just shades above listening to your ancient grandfather tell the same story about how he heroically defeated a goblin in his backyard, again.
"Allow me to consult with the king personally about this."
The guard huffed.
"But His Highness explicitly requested no visitors."
Harley turned to him, tilting her head innocently and reaching up to adjust her glasses.
"Not even me."
He flushed, looking away. He always had weird flashbacks about the cute librarian he had had a crush on when he was a kid whenever Harley looked at him like that, and it was unnerving. The worst part was, he was pretty sure she knew what he was thinking. You couldn't get anything past that woman. The Chancellor beamed.
"Well, then. Thank you very much for intervening on my behalf, Harley."
He patted her back appreciatively, and she bowed.
"Not at all. Now, if you two will excuse me."
She gently pushed past the guard and opened the throne room doors. Sure enough, Edward was lounging on his throne, his eyes closed and his fingers absent-mindedly strumming his harp. As soon as Harley stepped inside, the music came to a halt, but he refused to look up at her. His flaxen hair was hanging over his shoulders, his sapphire headband that he wore in place of a crown shyly peeking out beneath the wispy bangs that fell over his brown eyes. His legs, which were curled up in the throne, were dressed in orange slacks with a light square pattern stitched throughout, and tucked into brown calfskin boots. He wore a yellow lace-up vest with silver plate armor over his shoulders and arms, along with a white cape that he had thrown over one shoulder and a silk-screened green and yellow scarf to act as a mask in the desert winds.
"I believe I left specific word to turn away all callers,"
Edward said coolly, and as if to punctuate his point, plucked a sour note on the harp that made Harley shudder. It was like nails on a chalkboard.
"Even your own royal secretary, your highness?"
she asked, eyebrows raised. He finally lifted his gaze, sighing and lowering his harp next to his throne.
"Is this an urgent matter?"
Harley fanned through the papers she had been gifted with.
"Doubtful, my lord. I trust it is the Chancellor worrying himself over trivial matters yet again. I suspect he is more upset about you not acknowledging his concerns."
Edward shook his head.
"What is there for me to acknowledge? This is about our support pledge, I suppose. I thought I had left you in charge of that matter."
Harley felt a flush crawl up her face. Yes, he had left her in charge, but the Chancellor had obviously not been made aware of that fact, nor had Edward apparently done any due diligence in terms of making sure the support pledge was for a realistic amount that could potentially slip under the radar.
"I fear we can no longer keep it under wraps, your highness. Perhaps some reconsideration is in order."
Edward shook his head.
"There is no reconsidering to be done. The recovery of Damcyan was only made possible by our neighbors in Mist and Fabul."
Harley sighed. "This again?"
"Certainly, my lord, but to extend ourselves now to Evelyn as well. I know you were concerned about them continuing to auction their kingdom's treasures, and I moved the funds around where I could to purchase as many as possible. But the Chancellor is not incorrect about us now having stretched ourselves into the red. Our plan was counting on additional exports being made this month to make up the difference, and that has not happened."
Edward shrugged.
"Even in that instance, I was counting on you to take care of it for me. Only you have the talent for this post. Just mollify the Chancellor's concerns and find a potential solution that he can work on himself so he is out of my hair. I just want to help my friends, Harley. The Chancellor doesn't understand the true state of Damcyan's debt, he just sees numbers. You're the only one who understands what I am trying to do.
Harley looked away, gritting her teeth.
It is a great honor to hear such compliments, Your Highness. But even I cannot make money appear out of thin air. I'm not saying we should not help Evelyn, but perhaps there is a different way that we could still be of assistance to them. Would you at least consider that?
Edward nodded.
The affair is in your hands. Just do whatever needs to be done.
Harley looked down, bowing quickly.
Yes, Your Highness.
King Edward hasn't even talked to King Edge since the auctions started up again. He's just assuming Evelyn is in trouble, but from what all my research has shown, they appear to be fine. Perhaps His Highness knows that King Edge would not tell him anything anyway, but I just don't understand why Edward is jumping into this again all of a sudden. If he wants me to do whatever needs to be done, then perhaps I should just talk to King Edge myself. When Harley reached the throne room doors, she paused and looked over her shoulder.
If I may, my lord.
He blinked.
Yes.
Harley put her hands on her hips.
I believe there are times when the head of a kingdom must act with a firm, calculated hand. If the support pledge is something you really believe in, you must help your people understand why it is something they should believe in too. Then perhaps you would not feel as compelled to sneak around.
He watched for a moment, noticing that her eyes never moved away from his. She was waiting for a response, and she wouldn't leave until she got it. Finally, he relented and nodded.
True enough.
That did the trick. The doors opened, and she disappeared from sight, pulling them shut behind her. Edward hauled himself off the throne, wandering over to the nearest window and staring up at the cloudless night sky. Beneath, the sands of the Damsian desert swirled in the wind, forever shifting. It was never the same desert each time he looked upon it, yet he felt exactly the same. When the castle had been rebuilt, he had had the windows in the throne room restored exactly to the specifications of the previous castles. It had been this particular window through which the flaming arrows had been launched that stole Anna's life, where Edward had been standing before Anna pushed him out of the way. He often wondered if time had stopped for him on that day. Certainly, his body had aged, but nothing else had seemed to evolve within him to better prepare for what he was to become 17 years later. Is it because I was supposed to be the one who died that day, and now fate doesn't know what to do with me? The head of a kingdom. But no matter my title, neither Damsian nor I would be here now were it not for their voyage to the moon. Cecil. Edge. Rydia. I don't know how I could possibly ever make up for such a debt. I would do anything to make this pain go away. Suddenly, a flash of white light tore across the sky.
A falling star.
The Chancellor bellowed. He, Edward and Harley were gathered in the throne room the next morning to debrief on last night's and that morning's strange events, except that the Chancellor had apparently slept through all of them like a rock.
Yes,
Edward nodded, resting his head on his hand as he crossed his legs.
It appears to have landed in the vicinity of Fabul.
Harley blinked.
Ah. So last night's earthquake that I felt. Indeed. The shockwave from the impact, no doubt.
Harley bit her lip as her eyes flicked to the window.
Have you considered that it might be related to that second moon?
It had appeared so suddenly that morning that she could hardly believe it. She had to wipe her glasses down twice before she convinced herself it was real. Edward closed his eyes.
Yes.
The Chancellor started bellowing louder, racing about the room like a kid hopped up on sugar.
Then the horrors of the past have returned. The gods spare us, it's all over.
Edward lifted his head, sighing. Really, it was too early for all of this. He hadn't gotten a wink of sleep last night. That shooting star had become burned in his brain and it was all he could see when he closed his eyes. He had been tempted to visit Harley and see if she was still awake, but had talked himself out of it. What would she think of him, coming to her in the middle of the night?
Calm yourself, Chancellor. It is too early to make such conclusions.
Harley cracked her knuckles through her gloved hands, a habit that made everyone cringe but no one dared correct her on.
I think a full investigation of this object is in order, Your Highness.
Edward frowned.
I would like to inform Baron about this first. Cecil's viewpoint would be very helpful to us right now.
Harley shot him a look, but the Chancellor was all over it. He hated to admit it, but the idea of Cecil potentially driving Edward to make a decision about the shooting star made him feel more confident than Edward making one on his own.
I will summon a messenger immediately,
the Chancellor declared, and fled the room. Harley sighed, approaching the throne with less formality now that they were alone.
Your Highness. If I may presume to ask, please allow me to handle the investigation. We can still conduct one while the messenger travels to Baron, it won't hurt anything to do so.
Besides, this is your domain, Edward, you need to start acting like it. Edward stood from his throne, his brows knitted in concern.
Are you sure, Harley? I believe I have the requisite knowledge and experience for the position, my lord. It will be dangerous. Then allow me to bring several members of your guard along for emergencies.
Edward frowned. She had been a little too prepared with that remark, so she realizes it will be dangerous too. I can't let her go alone.
I will join you.
Harley shook her head.
But, Highness, who would guide our kingdom should something happen in your absence? I will be hardly missed. You, on the other hand, are a totally different story.
Edward looked away. He couldn't help but feel like he was being pushed away on purpose, like a little kid tugging on his mother's apron in the kitchen. Everything she said made sense, but was he really so incapable that she didn't even want him around for a measly investigation?
Still.
Harley rested her hand on his shoulder.
Please, my lord. You have nothing to worry about. This is why I am here. My lord. You called for me.
The Chancellor burst into the throne room, sweeping into a quick bow. Edward didn't even see it, he was gazing out the window again, his eyes glazed over in thought. He couldn't even remember what had happened throughout the day. Harley had left with a company of guards shortly after their conversation, and after that, it was a blur of faces he had forgotten and stretches of time where he would reach for his harp but just end up holding it in his hands, not playing a note. At least the Chancellor had stopped harping on him about the budget, the return of the moon had at least been useful in that respect.
Has Harley returned? Not yet, I'm afraid.
Edward frowned at his reflection in the glass.
Is there any word from the messenger we sent to Baron? Unfortunately, there is not, your highness.
Edward clenched his jaw, looking down at the floor.
Too much time has passed. Something has happened to Harley.
The Chancellor raised a hand.
We could deploy a search party upon my daybreak, my lord. Please remember that Harley had several guards with her, and she's no pushover, either. She's come a long way with self-defense training since she first entered through these doors.
Edward nodded listlessly. He knew it was his constant underflow of anxiety that was tricking him into overthinking the situation. Once in a while he had the lucidity to realize when he was perhaps being irrational. Usually though, Harley was that lucidity, it was so much easier to function when she was by his side.
A wise idea. We will wait until sunrise. Yes, your highness. I take my leave, then.
The Chancellor bowed, even though he knew Edward could not see him, he had not turned away from the window once throughout their entire conversation. He had been doing that more and more lately. He would transport himself decades in the past and barely register the presence of those in front of him.
Your highness. I suppose you did not get a great deal of sleep last night, either. Please, try to get some rest. I will. Thank you, Chancellor. Good night, your highness.
Edward heard the doors close behind him once more, and the overwhelming relief that came with being alone once more washed over him like a warm, soapy bath. He gazed up at the twin moons once more, pressing his lips together. Anna. Tella. He turned away from the window and bent down to retrieve his harp next to the throne. As he exited the throne room for the night, he swore he heard the scuffling of footsteps coming from the west. That was the tower Harley's room was in. Did she come home after all? Before he could stop himself, he climbed up the tower stairs and approached Harley's suite of rooms. But instead of a flash of blue hair, he saw instead a blonde maid stumbling out into the hall, her arms covered in laundry. She glanced at Edward behind the pile and gave a curt nod.
I was just changing Harley's sheets, sir. The bed is turned for when she comes home. Is there anything else you need me to do?
Edward shook his head.
No. Thank you.
She nodded again and slipped past him, bouncing down the stairs and disappearing from sight. Edward stole a peek into Harley's room. When she had first moved in, she had nearly passed out in delight at all the space he had given to her. She wasted no time filling it with a library of books that rivaled that of the castle. Her desk, a rich mahogany piece that she had bought with her first earnings, was positioned in front of a large window that granted the perfect view of evening sunsets across the sea Damsian bordered. It was covered in neat piles of papers and books, where he knew she would be up until all hours of the night conducting research on whatever new topic had captured her attention. He noticed that the room felt a little stuffy. The Damsian desert heat was no joke, and sometimes the only relief you could get was at night, and thought perhaps he should have asked the maids to crack the window. He leaned over her desk, cranking it open and smiling with relief as a cool breeze immediately washed in. Sliding some of her books over to use them as paperweights so that nothing blew away, he noticed that one was left open, and was filled with her neat, orderly cursive handwriting. Before he could stop himself, he found his eyes upon it, drinking in every word. It had been dated for that morning. She must have written it before she left for the investigation.
That moon has shown itself once more. Are those terrifying days of war about to stage a return? The peace we enjoy today is wholly a product of King Edward and his companions. Military might is not what will drive our kingdom in the future. Education and science are the true catalysts. I believe this so fervently that I traveled to Troya and devoted my younger days to study. This, and nothing else, allowed me to attain the position of royal secretary that I enjoy today. King Edward is too kind to me. My duties are stressful, but I find every day in this castle to be rewarding. If I could have it so, I would want this life for myself forever, a life free of war and strife. It may be my imagination, but as of late, the soothing, reassuring notes from King Edward's harp have taken on a timbre of deep sadness.
Edward frowned, stepping away from the book. Harley, even though I've been such a wreck as of late, you're still so happy to be here. It's been my pleasure to watch your dreams flourish and grow. I wonder why I cannot do the same for myself. After retreating back to his bedroom in the opposite eastern tower, Edward climbed into bed and spent what felt like hours staring at the ceiling, willing the chaos inside his head and heart to calm itself into a dull frenzy so he could at least try to sleep. Lowering his hand, he felt his finger brush against the cool metal strings of his harp at his bedside, and closed his eyes. The gentle sound of water lapping against the shore filled his ears. When he opened his eyes, he found himself staring at a pool of water, which was stained the same dark gray as his harp. But his reflection within was a burst of color. He realized he was at the northernmost oasis in Capo, the lake where Anna and Tella had been buried.
Why? Why am I here?
He asked aloud, his voice meeting silence. A reflection joined his in the lake, and when he looked up, he saw Anna floating above him, her red-brown hair falling over her shoulders in the same soft curls she had been wearing on what was supposed to be their wedding day. A gold circlet was wrapped around her forehead, and a matching gold and yellow dress hung from her arms, exposing her white shoulders. It had been Edward's favorite, and he had begged her to wear it the day they were to elope.
Anna!
Edward cried. It had been so long she had appeared in his dreams that he wanted to jump into the lake and embrace her. But she folded her hands, looking up at him with tears pooling in her cornflower blue eyes, so piercing that he felt himself stumbling back unknowingly.
Edward!
She rasped, her voice choked with sobs.
What is it, Anna?
She looked down at her folded hands, the tears spilling over her cheeks and splashing into the lake below.
Why must you look so sad?
Edward shook his head, reaching his hand out.
Anna! Please, tell me what I can do.
Just as his fingers were about to brush over her own, she faded away, and his eyes snapped open. He was back in his room in Damsian, his forehead drenched in sweat.
Anna!
He gasped aloud, sitting up. Why? After all this time? He glanced at the clock hanging from his wall. It was close to 4 in the morning, still dark out, but that meant he had at least managed to sleep until the next day. Tossing off his covers, he left bed and walked to a waiting basin of water, splashing his face and washing the sleep from his eyes. As quietly as he could manage, he crossed the walkway to the next tower, and peered into Harley's suite. It was just as it had been when he had left it the night before. The room was now pleasantly cool, but her bed was empty and had clearly been undisturbed since the sheets were changed. Shaking his head, he retreated downstairs and found himself wandering toward the castle gates. The summer bulbs that had been planted only a few weeks ago had erupted into a riot of beautiful flowers, some of them already overflowing the massive brick beds that had been installed along the path through the keep. Edward had picked every flower to be planted himself, one of the few castle infrastructure tasks he had never eventually passed on to Harley in her time there. He had grown up with a love of gardening thanks to his mother and eventually Anna, whom he had met in the desert gardens of Capo when she stumbled upon him playing his harp. Entranced by her beauty, he had blurted out an invitation to see the gardens at the castle, and with a bemused smile on her blood-red lips, she accepted, having no idea who he was.
"My lord, are you still having trouble sleeping?"
Edward blinked, lifting his head. He hadn't realized he had sat down next to one of the flower beds, one that carried a variety of a plant known as whisperweed. Contrary to the name, it wasn't a weed, it was a white lily that started off as long, slender blades of emerald grass that would eventually blossom into a flower, but not one of any particular beauty or charm. Because of this, it was not well sought after by many florists. The time, effort, and constant warm temperature needed to breed one to completion was not worth the effort or expense. But those who knew the true nature of the whisperweed, like the Damsian royal family, Cecil, Sid, Yang, and Tella, understood its secret value. Edward shook his head.
"Just rising earlier than usual, I suppose."
The guard nodded.
"Well, if you'll excuse me, Your Majesty, it is time for the changing of the guard. Have a good day."
Edward watched as the guard disappeared inside the castle, and looked toward the empty gate. It would only remain so for a few minutes at most. The other guard starting his shift was most likely making his way from the barracks on the eastern wing of the castle. If he were going to sneak away, now was the time to do it. The meteor likely landed in the area around Mount Hobbs. I'm sure of it now. Harley must have met some difficulty crossing the mountain passes. Edward found himself rising once more without quite comprehending what he was doing, and approached the castle gate. Just as his foot was about to hit the sands of the desert, he heard a shrill voice ring out behind him.
"Your Highness."
He whirled around, and much to his chagrin, found himself face to face with the Chancellor, along with 3 guards that he knew were some of the newer recruits to the castle. He often was a sympathetic ear to them at dinner when he would wander into the dining hall and listen to their stories about their debilitating drills for the day. It had never occurred to the guards that it was inappropriate to complain about what hard work it was to protect your own castle in front of the king himself, but Edward never judged them harshly for it. He had never been a fan of any kind of combat and admired their strength to put up with harsh conditions. He had acknowledged his limits in terms of his own strength long ago, stemming from the time Tella, an ancient mage who had forgotten most of his spells, nearly beat him to death with just a wooden staff in his very own throne room. Besides, it wasn't like they were barren, where the soldiers there could eat metal for dinner and spit out nails. The most these guards would probably ever face in their tenure at the castle was an angry sandworm.
"Your Highness, do you realize what time it is? Where are you going at this hour?"
The Chancellor barked. Edward laughed sheepishly.
"I just thought I'd get some fresh air outside."
The guards tittered, and the Chancellor smacked his palm against his forehead.
"Your Highness, we can hardly have the ruler of Damsian strolling outside by himself. Please. At least take these guards with you." "All right."
Edward relented, and the Chancellor stepped back, shaking his head.
"And don't stray too far away from the castle." "I know,"
Edward sighed, and the Chancellor gave him one last sharp look before retreating back inside. The guard that Edward had learned was the de facto leader of their little group. Amy stepped forward, her hand on her hip as the stinging desert wind whipped through her chin-length purple hair.
"So, Your Highness, where are we really going?"
Edward tilted his head.
"Are you up for a visit to investigate the meteor?"
Amy's eyes widened, and the tall man behind her, Toby, tugged down the scarf that he had pulled up over his mouth to protect himself from the sand. He had been being escorted by the Chancellor to his new post outside before they had run into Edward, and he had seemingly been reassigned to the role of babysitter.
"Isn't that where Harley and some of the others went yesterday?"
he asked.
"Did something happen to them?" "That's what I'm worried about."
Edward frowned, and the 3rd soldier, Jo, slid her visor down over her red hair, which was swept into textured spikes that made her look more like a gladiator than a cadet.
"Don't worry, sir, we'll find Harley and be back in time for breakfast."
They began their journey east, Edward remaining a few steps behind his 3 guards and letting himself fall back into a dream state as they took care of slaying any monsters that crossed their path. It didn't register with Edward that their numbers had seemingly increased overnight. Whenever he left the castle, which was admittedly rare, he was never without some sort of support anyway. The second moon hanging high in the sky, as full and round as its counterpart, brought him back to the last time he had seen the twin moons in the deserts of Damcyan. It was 17 years ago, right after Anna had died. Tella had stormed off in a rage, leaving Cecil and Rydia, whom at the time were barely acquainted themselves, to try to convince the defeated Edward to escort them to the Antlion Cave so that they could get a sand pearl to rescue Cecil's friend from desert fever. At the time, Edward hadn't understood anything that was going on. All he knew was that the love of his life was gone, his family and kingdom destroyed for seemingly nothing. He would have gladly just handed over the Crystal of Fire to Golbez and the Red Wings if he had known the terrible price they were to pay. Even knowing in hindsight what Golbez's plan had been, he would have still traded it for Anna's life, and he had been left to mourn with 2 strangers, one of them just a child, that were berating him for not wanting to fight back. He could still feel the sting on his cheek from where Cecil had slapped him across the face, a twisted start to what had become one of his dearest friendships. The 3 of them had fled east, just like he was doing now, but at the time, the twin moons had merely been a fixture in their lives that had been around for as long as all of them had been alive. None of them, least of all Cecil, who was more deeply embroiled in the Baronian conspiracy than any of them knew, had known the terror that was brewing on the smaller of the twin moons, that a race of sorcerers called the Lunarians were frantically trying to stop one of their own, Zemus, from destroying the blue planet so he could take it for himself. After Edward had helped Cecil save his friend, who had turned out to be the future Queen Rosa of Baron, he summoned the courage to join Cecil and Fabul to warn the monks who protected the Crystal of Wind that they would surely be next in Baron's crosshairs. Everything after that was a mess of memories that Edward still had never quite recovered. He remembered fighting the Red Wings, being struck down by Golbez and Cecil's best friend at the time, Kane. Next they were on a ship to Baron to try to steal an airship for themselves to fight Golbez on equal terms. But something had gone horribly wrong when the ship had been attacked by Leviathan, the god of the sea, and Edward had been thrown overboard. But miraculously, he had not died. He had not been sure of how many days or weeks he had lost, but he ended up getting rescued by the Epops of Troya. From that point on, he had only left his hospital bed in Troya once to join the Epops in a final assault against Golbez before Cecil and the others left for the moon. When he was finally strong enough to come home to Damcyan for good, the second moon was gone, vanished without a trace, and he had expected to never see it in the desert horizon again. Cecil had explained everything to him when he had gotten home from the moon, that as a half-Lunarian himself, he had learned that those Lunarians who still slept on the moon, patiently waiting for the day they could live on the blue planet in harmony with their human counterparts, wanted to make sure something like Zemus could never happen again. That was why they had made their moon leave the blue planet's orbit. But if the Lunarians have returned, why am I so filled with dread? They are Cecil's people. Zemus was the exception to their peaceful race. It's why I am anxious to hear Cecil's take on this. He'll know what to do. But Harley, if she gets wrapped up in an affair like that one from so long ago, I would never forgive myself. I would do anything to protect her dream of living in a peaceful world.
Your Highness, we have arrived. Do you want to go in, or?
Edward blinked, looking around. Indeed, they had arrived. He had nearly smacked into Amy with his legs still on autopilot when she had stopped to ask him what was next. The meteor had created an enormous crater that not only stretched west to the base of Mount Hobbs, but had plummeted so deeply into the earth that he could see pools of seawater draining within. The prairieland that had been in the way of the meteor's fall had been completely destroyed. He couldn't see any grass or plants within the rocky shelves of the crater, and the land surrounding it was starting to suffer as well. Dead grass crunched under their feet, and several trees were starting to petrify, their leaves and fruit already piled on the ground and rotting into sticky brown piles that were being feasted upon by desert flies and other pests. What's happened here? Edward blanched. Is she? Could Harley really be all right? A low fog had begun to form in the deepest parts of the crater. Edward feared if it had started while Harley was deep within, it could have caused her to get lost. Turning to Amy, Toby, and Joe, he gestured to the path Harley and the others must have taken to enter. Their footprints still remained in the dust that had been released when the prairie was ripped apart. Even the winds couldn't reach this place.
They must have gone this way, and I see no footprints indicating they have left.
Edward frowned.
Let's hurry after them. We'll take point,
Toby said.
Just stay close, Your Highness.
Slowly, The four of them stumbled into the crater, the rocks shifting and rolling beneath their feet, causing them to constantly grab onto one another for balance. The deeper they descended, the faster the air became chilled. Edward could see his breath rising in little white puffs as he wrapped his arms around himself. Toby and Joe remained behind with Edward as Amy scouted ahead, taking care to jump over a puddle of water that had become cloudy, and was for some reason, bubbling unpleasantly.
"Ah, my lord."
Edward, Toby, and Joe whirled around to find one of the guards who had left with Harley climbing down from a ledge he had been standing upon. It was a testament to how little of the outside world's light trickled into the crater that they had not noticed him until now.
"Oh, thank goodness. Are you all right?"
Edward gasped, and the guard nodded.
"Yes, sir. I apologize for worrying you. Our investigation has encountered numerous snags, the latest of which were a pack of monsters that climbed out of one of the bogs down here. I assure you, however, that it was nothing we couldn't handle." "Where is Harley?"
Edward asked quickly, and he pointed further down the trail Amy had taken.
"Straight ahead, my lord. There should be someone with her. I was just keeping watch here."
They continued onward, catching up to Amy, who had encountered the other guard herself. They both looked up as Edward approached.
"Your Highness. What brings you here, my lord?"
The soldier blinked, and Edward tried to force out a laugh that denoted confidence, even though the tremor he thought he was starting to sense was most likely him shaking in his own boots. "Harley? Where did you go?"
"I was getting a tad antsy, sitting around waiting for you." "It is too dangerous for you to be here, sir,"
the soldier protested, glaring at Amy.
"Newbie, why would you bring the king here?" "Because he ordered me to,"
Amy barked, raising a fist. Edward shook his head, stepping between them.
"Oh, I'm quite all right. If you can survive this, I certainly can. Is Harley up ahead?"
The soldier sighed, giving Amy a shove before turning back to Edward.
"Yes, my lord. She ignored our pleas and proceeded further." "I wonder where she gets that from,"
Joe whispered, and Toby snorted. Edward pretended to not hear them, pushing onward. Harley was pacing back and forth, most of her hair fallen from her bun as she frantically scribbled in the notepad she had retrieved from her breast pocket. Edward watched her from the ledge above, his arms crossed over his chest. She seemed perfectly fine, and he was surprised at how jubilant just seeing that for himself had made him feel, but something still didn't seem right. He let out a gasp as he saw Splasher weasel its way to the bank of one of the puddles Harley kept walking by, its bloodshot eyes trailing her form as it parted its mouth open to strike. Before Edward could call out, Harley had reached to her hip, grasping a chain whip he hadn't noticed under her coat and cracking it so swiftly that it sounded like a thunderclap. The Splasher went belly up in the water, dead, and began to dissolve into dust as it sank. Without missing a beat, Harley pulled back her whip, and flipped to another page in her notebook. "Whoa." Edward gulped. "I guess maybe it was a fool's errand to worry for her after all."
"What could this substance possibly be composed of? It is as if the earth itself has putrefied. Could this have come from the moon?"
She was muttering to herself now, and stopped pacing to scribble something else down. Edward jumped down from the ledge, and Harley looked up in surprise.
"Your Highness." "I told you coming here would be dangerous,"
Edward said, nodding toward the whip in her hand. Harley blinked, coiling it back up and fastening it back to the belt hanging above her hips.
"I deeply apologize for worrying you, my lord. I realize now perhaps I've been gone a bit longer than I anticipated. It will have nearly been a day and but a few hours."
Harley glanced at the watch on her wrist, surprised to see that he was right.
"But this is no ordinary meteor we are dealing with."
Edward looked around, shuddering. Was it his imagination, or was it getting even darker even though the sun surely had to be risen by now?
"It certainly seems that way."
Harley tapped her notebook, her loose hair framing her face as she stepped closer to Edward. Her breath was alit with urgency, and her eyes were sparkling behind her glasses. Whether it was terror or curiosity, he simply could not tell. Knowing her, it was a mixture of both.
"Something beyond our comprehension has landed here. That is the only conclusion I can make."
She slapped her notebook against her hip, and sighed.
"And what kind of conclusion is that?"
Edward, blushing at the sight of Harley in such a rare, excitable state, glanced up toward the sky. They had descended deeply enough that the fog had started to obscure his vision.
"The moon. Something must be going on up there."
Harley blinked.
"But why did you come here, Your Highness?" Didn't you trust that I would do a thorough job?
Edward turned to her, blushing deeper.
No, nothing like that. I just wanted to see the crash site with my own eyes. We had best return to Damcyan, Harley. This should be enough investigating for now. But, my lord.
Harley gestured toward the miles of crater that remained below them.
There's still so much more I have yet to see. For one thing, where is this fog coming from?
Edward grabbed her outstretched hand, tugging her closer.
The messenger from Baron should be back by now. Let us return to the castle.
Harley frowned. She knew an order when she heard one, it was best not to push her luck for now.
Yes, your highness.
She shook her hand free, and followed Edward back up the hill to where his company of guards was waiting along with Harley's.
Heading back?
Amy asked, eyeing Harley up and down.
You seem okay, Miss Harley. I've never been better, except for this puzzler of a meteor.
Harley blinked.
Were you expecting something different? Well, with the way His Highness was rushing out of the castle to find you, I expected you were in some kind of real danger.
Amy shrugged, and Edward clenched his fists.
Hold your tongue, soldier. Please take point and get us out of here.
Harley brought her hand to her mouth, sure that it was wide open. Edward. I thought you said you just wanted to see the meteor for yourself? What is the meaning of this? After they had made their way out of the impact site, Harley fished out her notebook once more, looking over at Edward. He was back to staring at the moons, totally lost to the world. Harley cleared her throat, and he looked over at her like she was a stranger.
Do you want to read my notes?
Harley asked, and Edward flushed, suddenly remembering how he had accidentally read her diary the night before. King Edward is too kind to me. Holding out his hand silently, she placed the notebook in his palm.
Are you sure you're okay, your highness?
Harley frowned, and he nodded, starting to read. She shook her head, pulling off her glasses to wipe the disgusting film that had built up on the lenses from the meteor, when a dark shadow in the distance caught her eye. The guards had noticed it too. They stopped walking abruptly, peering up into the sky with their hands held to their foreheads. The sun was high overhead now, making it difficult to see.
Your highness.
Harley gasped, slipping her glasses back on. Her vision restored, she could see what looked like a blood-red ship approaching Damcyan Castle from the southwest, getting closer and closer with each passing second. Edward lowered the notebook, following Harley's gaze. His fingers trembled when he realized what it was he was seeing, and wordlessly dropped Harley's notebook, where it landed with a soft plop in the sands beneath them.
The Red Wings.
Harley scooped up her notebook, pressing it to her chest like she was embracing a lost child.
Perhaps they are bringing back our messenger.
Logic told her it most likely wasn't Cecil or one of his friends. If they ever visited Damcyan, it was usually by one of Sid's personal ships. Certainly, it had been a long time since they had seen anyone from Baron, however. Time had gotten away from everyone as of late, it seemed. She wondered if that had been part of why Edward was so melancholy as of late. Now that she thought about it, he really hadn't seen any of his friends in ages. She was sure he got sick of listening to her and the Chancellor spar day in and day out.
I can only hope so,
Edward whispered, and Harley looked at him confusedly.
Pardon?
Edward shook his head.
We must hurry. The sight of the airship discomforts me.
At the castle gates, the guards disbanded. Amy, Toby, and Joe stayed with Edward and Harley, while Harley's guards left to report their findings to their commanding officer. The soldier waiting for them at the entryway to the castle nodded toward the airship that was parked outside.
The emissary from Baron is waiting for you, your highness. Our messenger is back as well, he's resting at the inn. Very good,
Edward said, not liking the way his pulse was starting to race. Wouldn't it have been enough to simply give their messenger word of whatever it was Baron needed to say? As they entered the keep, the Chancellor met up with them, all out of breath.
Your highness. Thank the gods you've come home. An emissary from Baron has arrived. I noticed, Chancellor,
Edward sighed.
So where is this emissary? He requested a tour of the castle while he was awaiting your return, my lord,
the Chancellor replied, and Edward winced.
A tour? Yes, my lord,
the Chancellor shrugged.
What was I supposed to do, tell him no? I had no idea how long you would be gone, since it seems you disobeyed my request to stay near the castle.
Edward crossed his arms over his chest, staring at his feet as they walked to the throne room as a group. Why now, of all times?
Has he been to the crystal chamber?
The Chancellor blinked.
Not yet, my lord. How could he, when you are the only one who can open it?
Edward frowned as he glanced at the gold and ruby ring that rested on his right hand. He had been wearing it ever since the day the new crystal room had been built, now only accessible via a hidden passage that could only be unlocked by pressing the insignia in just the right impression in the wall. It was so well hidden that even Edward had trouble locating it from time to time. He had given up on trying to memorize how many bricks up and from the left of the throne it was. He was pretty sure that Harley was the only one who actually knew, thanks to her near photographic memory. Only a few moments after they had entered the throne room, Edward heard voices from outside the open doors.
Right this way, sir. His Majesty has returned.
A Damscian soldier stepped in, and walking behind him was a pale male wearing a blue uniform with a bronze-brushed helmet resting over his head. He removed his helmet, kneeling before Edward silently. It was someone that Edward had never seen before, but that didn't mean anything. Most of his dealings with Baron had only ever been between himself, Rosa or Sid. Edward offered a warm smile.
On behalf of my kingdom, I welcome you to Damscian.
The emissary rose, cradling his helmet under his arm.
I come here with a message from the kingdom of Baron. There is no need for such ceremony, my friend,
Edward said gently.
I trust King Cecil is faring well. Yes, your Majesty. And what of Queen Rosa? Theodore must be a grown man by now, come to think of it. I am afraid I did not travel here to chat, your highness.
Edward nodded, although the hurt in his eyes was apparent. Harley couldn't help but give the emissary one of her patented death glares, not that he was paying any attention to her to make note of it.
My apologies. Then let us turn to the matter of King Cecil's message. Yes, your Majesty,
the emissary sighed, like he just wanted to get this over with.
His Majesty requests that the matter of the meteor be handled exclusively by Baron.
Edward frowned.
Why is that?
He shrugged.
I was not provided with any further information. I see,
Edward replied, looking away. Harley bit her lip, and the Chancellor glared, his arms crossed. The emissary took no notice of the sudden turn in the mood of the room.
The message is delivered. I shall be on my way.
He turned to leave, but just as he crossed the threshold, Edward looked up, running after him.
Ah, one moment, if you could.
The emissary took a deep breath, turning.
Yes, your highness.
Edward pressed his fingers together.
In circumstances like these, King Cecil would have personally paid a visit. That is the kind of person he is, and always has been.
The emissary stared at Edward for a few moments, his eyes unblinking.
I will be sure to pass that message along to his highness.
He swept into a low bow, and took his leave, taking care to pull the throne room doors shut behind him.
Your highness. What is the meaning of this?
The Chancellor cried.
Such blatant disrespect.
Edward shook his head, although he could hardly believe it himself.
I trust that Cecil has due motivation for this decision. But, my lord.
Edward pressed his lips together.
Perhaps I ought to pay him a visit. You mean to go see King Cecil personally?
Something just isn't right. Why wouldn't he have just come to tell me this kind of news himself? If I could just look into Cecil's eyes, I would know the truth. I'm sure of it. Edward nodded. His decision had been made.
Yes.
End of chapter.